This is Shirley Jan Johnson, July 24th, 2024. I said that my next video was going to be about reports that the Iranians could have been behind Donald Trump's fake assassination attempt. But after I listened to part of Trump's speech at the RNC, and after reading the letter from his doctor, Ronnie Jackson, I decided to make this video instead. Because in researching, I found that some of Dr. Jackson's statements are inconsistent with other doctors, and it appears he's just going along with Donald Trump's lying narrative of what happened. Or should I say, what didn't happen. Also in this video, I'm going to show you a picture of how Donald Trump's ear would look once it's healed, according to professional doctors. So I'm going to start with some of the statements that Dr. Jackson made in his letter. I have been with President Trump since that time. I have evaluated and treated his wound daily. He is doing well. As reported and witnessed by the entire world, he sustained a gunshot wound to the right ear from a high-powered rifle used by the would-be assassin. The bullet passed, coming less than 1/4 of an inch from entering his head, and struck the top of his right ear. The bullet track produced a 2-centimeter wide wound that extended down to the cartilaginous surface of the ear. According to Calculate Me, 2 centimeters is equivalent to 0.7874015 inches. So I'm going to just round it down to 0.75 inches, just for ease of calculation. So it's actually a little less than 2 centimeters. 0.75 is equivalent to 3/4 or 3/4 of an inch. So 2 centimeters roughly equals 3/4 of an inch. Actually, it's a little more than 3/4 because I round it down. But we'll just use 3/4 of an inch. This is from lnctips.com. Wound sizing. As nurses, we know that wounds should be measured and recorded precisely, and we know that wounds are tracked by their size in centimeters. Unfortunately, jury members and other non-medical people in the United States are unfamiliar with the metric system. If you tell them a wound is 10 centimeters long, jury members may picture a wound that is 10 inches long instead of its real length of 4 inches. As a new legal nurse consultant, you can assist attorneys and eventually juries by describing wounds in both centimeters and inches. It's even more helpful if you can describe how the wound compares to common objects that everyone is likely to understand. The attorney might even hold up that common object in front of a jury one day. So here's a list of common sizes in centimeters and objects corresponding to that size. So as you can see, according to lnctips.com, 1.9 centimeters, which is a little smaller than 2 centimeters, is equivalent to the size of a penny. So 2 centimeters is actually a little bigger than the size of a penny. So in other words, the bullet removed a little more than 3/4 of an inch of cartilage. A little larger than the size of a penny from Donald Trump's ear. Remember, Donald said, "I knew immediately that something was wrong in that I heard a whizzing sound, shots, and immediately felt the bullet ripping through the skin. Much bleeding took place." So the AR-15 bullet ripped away over 3/4 of an inch of cartilage from Donald Trump's upper right ear. Another statement from Dr. Jackson's letter. There was initially significant bleeding, followed by marked swelling of the entire upper ear. The swelling has since resolved and the wound is beginning to granulate and heal properly. Based on the highly vascular nature of the ear, there is still intermittent bleeding, requiring a dressing to be in place. Given the broad and blunt nature of the wound itself, no sutures were required. So Donald Trump and his doctors wants us to believe that an AR-15 bullet ripped through Donald Trump's upper right ear ripping away over 3/4 of an inch of cartilage. And Donald Trump didn't receive a cartilage graft or any stitches. Dr. Jackson said, due to the blunt nature of the wound, no stitches were required. Now, according to my research, rifles or gunshots don't produce blunt wounds. They produce penetrating wounds. This is from National Library of Medicine. Blunt impact injuries result from direct contact of a blunt object with the body. A contusion results from the blunt impact of significant force to rupture capillaries underneath the skin surface while leaving the skin surface intact, while an abrasion results from scraping off of the superficial epidermis. Blunt impact of significant force to a bone results in a fracture. This is from the website AMBOSS. Blunt trauma. Blunt trauma is a non-penetrating injury caused by the impact of a blunt object against the body, resulting in damage to underlying structures. Common causes include motor vehicle collisions and falls from height. Again, from National Library of Medicine. Gunshot wounds are complex, violent, traumatic injuries commonly encountered in forensic practice. These injuries are caused by penetration of the body with projectiles ejected from a barrel due to the ignition of gunpowder. Again, from AMBOSS, the website AMBOSS. Penetrating trauma is an injury caused by a foreign object piercing the skin. And that's what Donald Trump said. It ripped through his skin, piercing the skin, resulting in damage to underlying structures and an open wound. The most common types of penetrating injuries are gunshot wounds and stab wounds. So, as you can see, gunshot wounds are not blunt wounds. They produce penetrating wounds. And Dr. Jackson said that Donald Trump's ear is healing properly. This is from the website lacerationrepair.com. It's called Closing the Gap. Every scar tells a story, but that story doesn't have to be a graphic novel. The mission of Closing the Gap is to teach emergency and urgent care providers to perform best techniques in acute wound care using evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice. Now here's the evidence they provided. Check out this picture, people. The upper caption reads, "Here's an ear laceration that a colleague of mine saw in a resource-poor environment on a medical mission several years ago. Because she did not have access to suture material, the wound was cleaned and allowed to heal by secondary tension. The wound healed as shown." The caption below the picture says, "An ear laceration seen days later in a resource-poor environment. It was left to heal by secondary intention, resulting in unfortunate cosmetic deformity. Convinced yet about the importance of treating these injuries carefully?" And then it goes on to talk about the videos that they have on their website. This is from the website Medical News Today. Secondary wound healing. Secondary wound healing, or secondary intention wound healing, occurs when a wound that cannot be stitched causes a large amount of tissue loss. Doctors will leave the wound to heal naturally in these cases. Secondary wound healing relies on the body's own healing mechanisms. This process takes longer, which may be due to increased wound size, the risk of infection and contamination, and other factors, such as the use of certain medications. So Donald Trump's ear is healing by secondary intention. And Dr. Ronnie Jackson said it's healing properly without stitches. Now that contradicts the evidence presented by the doctors at lacerationsrepair.com, showing a deformed ear due to not being stitched. And remember, this is a laceration, not a high-powered gunshot wound, or a gunshot wound from a high-powered rifle, which would have removed 2 centimeters or a little more than 3/4 of an inch of cartilage from Donald Trump's ear. Now, I flipped the damaged ear so that it would appear to be a right ear, since we're comparing it to Donald Trump's right ear, but it's actually her left ear. Now, do you really believe that Donald Trump, a professed billionaire who lives in a resource-rich country, would allow his ear to heal by secondary intention, only to be left walking around with his ear looking like this? Really? Check out that website. There's about a 2 to 3 minute video showing the procedure and necessary treatment of a laceration of the ear. They said that while a boy was horsing around with his friend, he fell on his face and cut his ear. And the laceration required stitches, some type of mold of the ear to prevent hematoma formation, and some other stuff. And the patient's head was wrapped. But Donald Trump only needed a patch over his ear as treatment for a gunshot wound. And the bottom picture shows an AR-15 bullet hole in his skull. Again, you'd have to be a fool to believe that.
One Dr. Sunil Dand, internal medicine physician. President Trump got shot in the ear, and it was a total miracle that he didn't get hit in the back of his head. If you look at the video again, how he moved his head at the last moment.
Now, according to Dr. Sunil Dand, Dr. Ronnie Jackson, and many other people, the bottom illustration is what they're saying actually happened to Donald Trump. The bullet hit his upper right ear. And according to Dr. Dand, the top picture is where the bullet would have hit if Donald Trump hadn't turned his head at the last moment. Now, this top illustration of the head proves exactly what I said in my other videos, that the bullet would have gone right through Donald Trump's skull, but not as far in as Dr. Dan shows with the red line, but where the yellow line is. Because as you can see, the bullet entered right where his ear connects to his skull. But nonetheless, it would have gone through his skull, people. And you really believe that doctors patched that up and then Donald went golfing the next day? Again, only a fool would believe that. This garbage is an insult to anyone's intelligence. Donald Trump would have been dead or in the ICU, period. Now, I don't know if this applies here because it's talking about military, but it sure is interesting. This is from the website pathologyoutlines.com, and it says rifle wounds, generally used in the military field. In contact wounds of the head with centerfire rifles, there's massive tissue destruction of the skin, skull, and brain with a heterogeneous pattern of entrance and exit wounds. This is from the Gun Zone. Are AR-15s centerfire or rimfire? AR-15s are typically chambered for centerfire cartridges. So, they say that the shooter used an AR-15 weapon. And according to pathologyoutlines.com, centerfire rifles in contact wounds of the head with centerfire rifles, there is massive tissue destruction of the skin, skull, and brain. And according to this picture, Donald Trump was shot in the head. And Donald Trump, more than likely, would have been dead. And if he did survive it, he would be in the ICU. He would not be out golfing with a patch on his ear. Based on the highly vascular nature of the ear, there is still intermittent bleeding, requiring a dressing to be in place. This is from theheal.com. According to an interview published earlier this week, this article was written July the 20th, 2024. According to an interview published earlier this week in the New York Times, Jackson had been on board Trump's plane the day following the rally. He redressed Trump's ear while flying to Wisconsin for the Republican National Convention. The bullet took a little bit off the top of his ear in an area that, just by nature, bleeds like crazy, Jackson told the Times. That area of the ear is called the helix. Now, Dr. Ronnie Jackson said that by nature, that part of the ear is highly vascular, meaning it has a large number of blood vessels, and bleeds like crazy, he said. That's just the opposite of what Dr. Sunil Dan said.
Was actually shot in the ear, and you saw afterwards blood streaking down the ear, and from a medical standpoint, the ear is made of cartilage, so it is not as full of blood vessels, arteries, veins as many other parts of the body. So even if there's not full penetration, there won't be catastrophic bleeding.
Dr. Sunil Dan said that part of the ear is made up of cartilage, and there's not a lot of blood vessels in that part of the ear, so there won't be catastrophic bleeding. And I also read a document that said pretty much the same thing as Dr. Dan. But Donald Trump claims that there was so much blood coming from his ear that his hand was covered with blood. There was blood everywhere.
The assassin's bullet came within a quarter of an inch of taking my life. I heard a loud whizzing sound and felt something hit me really, really hard on my right ear. I said to myself, wow, what was that? It can only be a bullet. And moved my right hand to my ear, brought it down. My hand was covered with blood, just absolutely blood all over the place. There was blood pouring everywhere, and yet in a certain way I felt very safe. The amazing thing is that prior to the shot, if I had not moved my head at that very last instant, the assassin's bullet would have perfectly hit its mark, and I would not be here tonight. We would not be together. And there's an interesting statistic. The ears are the bloodiest part. If something happens with the ears, they bleed more than any other part of the body. For whatever reason, the doctors told me that, and I said, why is there so much blood? He said, it's the ears. They bleed more. They knew I was in very serious trouble. They saw it. They saw me go down. They saw the blood and thought, actually, most did, that I was dead. They knew it was a shot to the head. They saw the blood.
Now, does it look like Donald Trump's hands were covered in blood? Bleeding like crazy? Blood all over the place? No, because that never happened. There's only one drop of blood on his jacket. No blood on his white shirt. Didn't want to mess up his nice shirt, you see. And there's no blood on his hands either. So how did the 2 streaks of blood get on his face? There's no blood running from his ear, and there's no blood on his hands. And he certainly didn't get shot in the skull with an AR-15 bullet. And if the media is allowed to continue saying there was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump's life and airing pictures of Donald Trump with a bullet hole in his skull, then Congress needs to subpoena Donald Trump, Dr. Ronnie Jackson, Butler Memorial Hospital staff, and the Secret Service agents that were on the scene, and make them answer under oath questions and show evidentiary proof of what's being reported worldwide. People died that day. This ain't no reality show. But that's just how far America has fallen. For shame. For shame. And they need to answer why they faked an AR-15 bullet hole. And they need to answer how they knew the shooter would be using an AR-15 rifle in order for them to fake that type of bullet. Think about it, people. Think about it. And you'd have to question the integrity of the people who are continuing to push this false narrative that Donald Trump miraculously survived an AR-15 bullet to his skull or to his upper right ear and then went golfing the next day. He had no cartilage grafting and no stitches. Seriously? Go check out that website, lacerationsrepair.com. Check out part 2 and view the short 2 to 3 minute video.
One Dr. Sunil Dan, internal medicine physician. As for President Trump himself, It was really a miraculous escape, because if you look at the video, he moved his head at the last moment.
It's such an honor to stand with him after what happened last Saturday. I'm sure that you've heard a lot of people say this, but you will never be able to convince me that that last second turn of the head was anything other than a miracle. I absolutely believe that.
I would like for Sunil Dan, Dr. Sunil Dan, and J.D. Vance, and all these other people who are claiming it was just a miracle that Donald Trump turned his head at the last moment to miss a gunshot wound to the head. Yet this picture shows clearly there's a gunshot wound to his head, and it entered his head right where his ear is attached to the skull. And again, according to Sunil Dan, the bullet would have gone right through his skull if it had entered his ear at this point. So these people are deceivers. They're lying and deceiving. They are just covering for Donald Trump. They are just covering for this wicked man and steady blaspheming and talking about, oh, God protected him. Oh, he's God's man. He's God's man of chaos. The Bible says that the devil is the author of confusion and chaos. So now we know which God they're talking about. They're not talking about the creator of all the universe, the one and only true and living God. We know who they're talking about, who their God is then. If he's the God, God's man of chaos, then they're talking about Lucifer. Time to wake up, people.